They say that silence is the most dangerous sound before a storm, and for a young Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the boy who would become Pope Francis, silence was everywhere. Not peace, not calm, but silence that swelled in the cracks of his broken city. He was only a teenager in Buenos Aires, a time when Argentina was beginning to fracture under political unrest and authoritarian rule. The streets whispered of disappearances, priests were being watched, and neighbors would vanish overnight. Jorge felt it not in speeches, but in the emptiness where children used to play. That silence haunted him. It was the sound of a society beginning to devour itself, and in that silence, he began to listen. Not to the noise of power, but to the quiet agony of people nobody heard. He was 19 when it happened. His friend Roberto, a fiery idealist who talked of justice and revolution, was taken in the night. No warning, no farewell. One moment they were arguing over tea about theology and politics. The next morning, his chair at the seminary cafeteria was empty. That absence tore through Jorge like a razor. Because Roberto wasn't just a friend, he was a mirror. He had the same questions, the same fire, the same belief that the world could be more than the violence they'd inherited. But now, he was gone, disappeared into the mouth of a regime that labeled compassion as rebellion. And in that moment, Jorge faced a question that would haunt him for decades. Was silence a form of complicity? He could have stayed quiet. Most did. Many who spoke up were never seen again. But something in Jorge was different. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ambition. It was a kind of grief that made standing still unbearable. He began to speak, not loudly, but precisely. Not for attention, but for truth. When he entered the Jesuit order, he wasn't looking to rise. He was looking to serve, to understand the pain no one else wanted to carry. He went into the slums, not to preach, but to learn. He sat with the poor, the addicts, the abandoned. He didn't quote scripture, he listened to stories. And slowly, something inside him shifted. The silence was still there, but now it had a voice. His, but service, came at a cost. When he became head of the Jesuits in Argentina during the dictatorship, Jorge was thrown into a moral crucible. 2 priests under his care were kidnapped, and some would later accuse him of not doing enough to protect them. For years, that shadow followed him, staining even his most selfless acts. He carried that guilt like a wound beneath his robes. Because in times of fear, there are no perfect heroes, only imperfect humans making impossible choices. And sometimes, the burden of leadership is not in what you do, but in what you couldn't prevent. That's what kept Jorge awake at night. The belief that maybe he failed them, that maybe he failed God. Still, he did not retreat. He went deeper into the heart of suffering, and it was there, in the poorest corners of Argentina, where he began to understand something most powerful men never do, that greatness does not lie in power, but in proximity to pain. He saw how systems consume the weak to protect the strong. He saw children grow up too fast, mothers age too young, and dignity rot beneath bureaucracy. And one afternoon, he watched a boy give his only piece of bread to his younger sister. No sermon was more sacred than that. That was when Jorge remembered, a line he would one day preach. Rivers do not drink their own water. We are born to help each other. But there was still something inside him, a wound he couldn't heal. The world saw a priest. But inside, Jorge felt more like a ghost, drifting between the power structures of the church and the invisible agony of the people. He lived in a small room, took public transport, cooked his own meals. Yet even as he tried to disappear into simplicity, Rome was watching. They saw a man who refused comfort, who turned down titles, who wept in slums and spoke in parables. They feared him. Because men like Jorge don't rise through the church, they slip through the cracks. And that's exactly where the truth lives, in the cracks. So when Rome came calling, he was ready. Not because he wanted to lead, but because he was done hiding. The Vatican was not a sanctuary, It was a chessboard. Cardinals maneuvered like kings. Alliances were made in whispers, and scandals dripped from sacred halls. Jorge walked in not as a player, but as a man carrying his dead friends, his shame, his slum prayers. When he was elected Pope in 2013, the world cheered. But inside, Jorge cried. Because to him, this wasn't a coronation. It was a funeral for the man he used to be. Pope Francis was born in white robes, but Jorge, the haunted boy from Buenos Aires, never left. And from that day on, he vowed to make the church bleed honesty again. The war was not over. The war was inside. Inside the church. Inside the souls of leaders addicted to gold and glory. Pope Francis didn't declare war. He whispered truth. He washed the feet of prisoners. He ate with the homeless. He kissed the scarred. Every act was a rebellion dressed as mercy. And yet, behind the scenes, enemies sharpened their blades. They called him a Marxist, a heretic, a threat. They leaked documents. They plotted against him, but he didn't flinch, because he had already survived worse. The dictatorship, the disappearances, the shame. He had buried too many ghosts to fear men in robes. One morning, he was asked if he feared being assassinated. He smiled quietly. "I may die," he said, "but the church must live." That was his creed, not to preserve himself, but to ignite something greater. He knew the institution needed more than reform. It needed resurrection, and that meant blood. Not physical, but spiritual. A sacrifice of pride, of comfort, of political safety. Every choice he made, from denouncing clerical abuse to challenging capitalism, was a knife against tradition. But it was also a prayer that the world might one day believe in grace again. And yet, even now, he walks with a limp that no one sees. Because what they don't tell you about being Pope is that it's lonely, truly lonely, surrounded by people, yet starved. Of intimacy, he carries secrets no one will ever read. He mourns not just friends, but faiths lost in scandals. But still, he rises. Every day, not to rule, but to serve. Because in the silence before every storm, there is a voice that must speak. And now it is his. A voice not of power, but of pain. A voice shaped by slums, by betrayals, by bread shared between starving siblings. There's a moment in every life when the line between past and present blurs. When one decision echoes louder than 100 prayers. For Pope Francis, that moment came not in a grand cathedral, but in the echo of an unanswered letter. Years before he became Pope, a mother had written to him. Her son had been molested by a priest. She begged for help. Her words weren't poetic. They were broken, frantic, desperate. Jorge read it once, twice. Then he passed it up the chain, like protocol demanded. But the letter vanished, and so did the justice. Years later, as Pope, he found that same letter in a hidden Vatican file. And in that moment, he felt it, the crushing weight of a single choice left undone. He could have buried it. He could have called it an administrative failure, or blamed the bureaucracy that swallowed it whole. But Francis didn't. He brought it into the light. He wept, not for the institution, but for that mother, for that child. He called the Vatican's top clergy and told them the truth. The church must beg forgiveness. Some applauded, many recoiled, but he didn't care. Because the man who once failed to act had learned that silence is not neutral. It's violence, in disguise. And from that day forward, his papacy would be marked by an unrelenting pursuit of the truth, even when it burned. The church, however, does not change like a man. It resists, claws, survives. For every reform Francis announced, a dozen obstacles rose like ghosts from marble halls. Cardinals leaked documents. Bishops questioned his authority. Media twisted his words. And even as he denounced abuse, Even as he wept at victims' feet, many accused him of not doing enough, but they didn't see the torment behind his eyes, the torment of a man haunted not just by what he did, but by what he couldn't undo. Every step forward was met with whispers of betrayal. Every call for justice was countered by threats of schism. Yet Francis kept going, because he wasn't trying to save his legacy. He was trying to save souls. And still, he carried another wound, perhaps the deepest of all. Jorge had once dreamed of becoming a missionary in Japan, where he believed he could lose himself in silence, simplicity, and humility. But due to a lung condition in his youth, he was denied the chance. That denial crushed him, but in hindsight, that dream had to die for something greater to live. His path was not eastward, it was downward, into the dark belly of a broken church, into the raw grief of families whose children were betrayed by the very men who baptized them, into the heart of capitalism's cold machine, where the poor were crushed while the powerful praised God from yachts. He went where the wounds were because he carried his own. The world kept asking, why is this Pope different? The answer wasn't in his speeches, it was in his scars. Pope Francis is a man who knows the taste of regret, a man who's watched revolutions die in silence, a man who's seen theology weaponized against the weak. His sermons are not thunderous, they are trembling, because they come from a place of shared fragility. That's why people listen, not because he claims perfection, but because he admits failure. He is not the voice of a flawless church. He is the voice of a church gasping for breath, trying to remember what compassion feels like. He once said, "The things we hold end up holding us," and he lived that. As Pope, he refused the opulent papal apartments, chose a modest guest house instead. He rides in a Ford instead of a limousine. He wears old shoes. These are not gestures, they are declarations that the church does not belong to emperors, that the gospel was never meant to be sold. Every time he stripped away gold, it was an act of defiance, not against tradition, but against hypocrisy. He was reminding the world that Jesus washed feet. He didn't sit on thrones, but not everyone wanted that reminder. Wealthy elites, both inside and outside the church, began to turn. Francis's critique of unregulated capitalism, his demand for environmental justice, his defense of migrants, all made him a threat. They called him political, radical, dangerous. They said he was dividing the church. But Francis knew, unity, built on silence, is not unity. It's a mausoleum. And if the church was to be reborn, it had to go through fire. And so, he lit the match. With every encyclical, every speech, every act of mercy, he was burning down a palace to build a refuge. Still, there was always a cost. The more he gave, the lonelier he became. Friends he trusted betrayed him. Allies grew cold. Even within the Vatican, his inner circle narrowed. Sometimes, in interviews, he pauses for long stretches, as if searching for words buried too deep to reach. The weight of the world sits heavy on his shoulders, not metaphorically, but literally. He walks slower now, breathing is harder, and yet he refuses to stop, because he knows that real revolutions are not loud. They are quiet. They happen in hearts, in homes, in the invisible corners of the world where kindness still dares to survive. In recent years, he's begun preparing for the end, not with fanfare, but with reflection. He has hinted that, like his predecessor, he may one day step down. That being Pope is not a throne to die on, but a burden to hand over. But before he leaves, he wants the church to remember something, not a doctrine, not a rule, but a truth. That rivers do not drink their own water, that life is not meant to be hoarded, but given. That faith without service is theatre, and that we are not called to be powerful, but to be present. Because in the end, Pope Francis's legacy will not be in buildings or doctrines, it will be in the stories of the refugee he hugged, the prisoner whose feet he washed, the atheist he listened to, the mother whose letter he never forgot. These are the gospels he lived, the ones written not on paper, but on flesh. And long after he's gone, long after his robes are folded and his name etched into history, the question will remain: did we listen? Did we learn? Did we become the church he believed was still possible? Because the silence is returning. The world trembles again. In war, in greed, in division. And once more, we must choose between comfort and conscience, between gold and grace, between fear and love. And maybe, just maybe, we'll remember his voice, not the Pope's, but Jorge's, the boy who lost his friend, the man who stood in slums, the old priest who whispered to the world, "We are all born to help each other."